For those that don't know, I was the former Director General of PFRA for a number of years in the early new millennium, and spent a lot of time working with my professional colleagues, and I see some of them are here, some retired a little while ago, some more recently, and the folks in the room probably have a heck of a lot more experience understanding the intricacies of managing pastures and water networks than I do. I'm not a professional agrologist or a biologist. I'm an executive manager, and I understand a little bit about organizations and how they run. I understand a little bit about governments and how they develop policy. I understand a little bit about retaining competency, and I understand a lot about incentives. And we'll talk a lot about incentives. We've talked about incentives under Doug's presentation, what motivated behavior in the past. Under Trevor's discussion, we see a little bit of incentives and motivations of the current, what would motivate us to want to be here today to talk about preservation of a program of great importance to Western Canadians in particular, but to probably most Canadians and our international citizens as well. So I'll talk more about the future. What is the art of the possible, okay, given our current situation? So currently I'm working with First Nations, and I want to clarify because I'm becoming a pretty good student of how people view certain communities. And working with First Nations and addressing groups like the one I am today, it's quite interesting. When I say First Nations, it's a natural tendency of most people to say that Carl is up here representing all First Nations. I'm not, okay? Most communities are fragmented. First Nations are no different. First Nations have representation through FSIN, the Saskatchewan Indian First Nations Association, but there are also a plethora of First Nation bands scattered throughout the province. I'm representing 7 of those bands, okay, distinct bands. So after the session today, don't fall into the trap of saying, we know clearly, Carl told us what the First Nation position is. Carl is representing 7 First Nation bands, okay? Some of the chiefs will be here later on today, and you can talk to them. I am not representing a common-based proposal for all First Nations, okay? Okay.
How many bands are there?
In the province, in the southern part of the province, there's about 72 in Saskatchewan. Thank you. Yeah. Okay. But predominantly, this is motivated by southern bands, not northern bands. Okay. Now, I'm just going to talk about, before I get into our initiative and why we think the initiative has the ability to afford traction for the many rather than the few, I want to talk a little bit about what motivated us to come up with this proposal. What are the imperatives or the underpinnings that we need to consider to make sure that our proposal has the kind of ingredients that would address the various interests of the stakeholders that have some legitimacy to the pastures, including the ones that don't vote. We saw a bunch of them just a minute ago, right? Swift Fox, unfortunately, don't have a say. Yet we have to speak for them. Okay? It's our duty as Canadian citizens who care, okay, to ensure that everybody, even though they might not cast a ballot, has a say in this process. So first and foremost, we saw the federal and provincial governments make a significant policy decision. Now, I worked for government for 32 years at pretty senior levels, and I've worked at the provincial level as a senior policy person, and I've worked at the federal level. And more and more I see this migration of important policy decisions being embodied in fiscal discussions. Okay, it's all about the money. We got to cut the budget. We got to get the budget balanced. It's all about jobs. Okay? Now, personally, I don't work very well in a 10-second soundbite world. Okay? I don't work very well when a government or government representatives say, control your message, Carl. Control my message? What's that mean? That means control your audience. Also, on significant policy discussions, it doesn't matter what you think, it's what we say that matters. I don't know about you, but the previous presenters told us that if we don't engage and if we don't involve our citizenry in these important discussions, we're likely going to make mistakes. Okay? And we've been in fiscal problems before. This is not new. But what's happening is we are starting to neuter more and more the debate and the dialogue and the insightfulness that comes from engagements like this. And I dare say, I'm just curious, is there anybody here that is currently working for the federal provincial government? Okay. Now I'll rephrase it. Is there anybody here that's actually working for the provincial or federal government but doesn't want to put their hand up? Perfect. Unfortunately, we're seeing when we control the message, we're disengaging. Okay, why would not this whole room be loaded with policy people who are curious from a federal and provincial perspective? It's because their mind is made up, and it's not so much the public servants, right? The politicians have said, this is what we're going to do. We're going to control it. We're going to ensure it happens. Okay? So don't confuse us with facts. The decision has been made. Okay? And we need to raise the bar a little bit in terms of that discussion. And we need to assert it. And I've had the opportunity under this joint venture to participate in some discussions with media. Okay? Now the sad reality is, and I think I talked to the coordinators, I was really having a passionate discussion with them because it really got my craw. And in a media concerned way, not in a personal way. My concern is two women come from Africa on a student visa. They accidentally go and work for Walmart for five minutes. They realize they're in violation. They hastily run to a church, incarcerate themselves in the basement. This makes local news, it makes regional news, it makes national news, and it makes international news. Okay? Now, I'm all for the protection and the interest of immigrant. My parents were immigrants, so I understand the importance of that, and I understand that people do make mistakes, and I don't think we should punish people for that. But how do two young students from Ethiopia reach in, pardon? Nigeria, sorry, thank you. Make international news. We have the biggest land transfer in Western Canada in over 100 years, over 2 million acres. And I was just on the radio on Tuesday morning, okay? A national broadcaster, but it was a local program. The interviewer was somewhat disinterested, wondering why she was interviewing me about this joint venture. How important is it, right? As soon as my interview was done, she went into a discussion about seasonal cooking, and she was beside herself. I don't get it, but I guess this is our reality, okay? So, hopefully, to me, it's our duty to raise the bar. It's our duty to immobilize our discussion. It's our duty to reinforce with our governments of the day that this is worth talking about, and we are not going to accept this policy decision wrapped up in an omnibus bill of 400 pages to be blended in with all those other cuts that you're making. This is too important. Okay? Now, when we take a fiscal view, and I saw this more and more, and some of my colleagues, they were very supportive when they saw me come off the plane from Ottawa, right? I'd be like the worn-out boxer, right? Because being a Western Canadian representative in a government that's more and more centralized, it gets harder and harder to speak with regional voice with any weight. Okay? So they tend to marginalize your perspective, saying, look it, you guys in Western Canada don't get it. Okay? You don't, why do we have dams and pastures? And I says, you don't get it. You have no idea that in Western Canada, most of us here today that live in Western Canada, if it wasn't for the work of PFRA and the provincial professionals back in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, putting in water control structures that helped us manage our seasonal water flows, we would not enjoy the life that we have here today. These were strategic investments to raise the bar for quality of life for Western Canadians. And they still are important. No matter who manages them, they're still important. Pastures are still important. But if you take a fiscal lens, you can make anything unimportant. Okay? So I don't believe, and most of my colleagues in First Nations land don't believe that the program was cut because it was not a successful program. It's just 400 PYs that can be cut, that can be removed from the budget to balance the expenditures. And guess what? It's prairie land. Who's going to make a beef of it in Eastern Canada? Does it really matter? So if we look at the program that PFRA managed, they didn't own it. The federal government doesn't really own this land. It owns some of it. If you look at the pastures, pasture by pasture, they're a mosaic of tenureship, right? And it's going to take a long time to sort that out. However, the intent was never ownership. It was professional management. PFRA's pasture program is about building competency, doing things well, okay, and ensuring that the various stakeholder interests are addressed. And you saw it through the mandates and the objectives, that it wasn't just about making money, okay, it wasn't just about cattle. There was various interests, and that's what was their intention. So if ownership isn't the issue, then let's focus on a solution that looks like retaining competency and professionally managing these vast tracts of land. First Nations, and I'm getting a real taste of this aversion of most of people in society to not work with First Nations, okay? And the joke is, when I talk to most of the chiefs, they say, you know, it would be a whole lot easier to work with white people, right, if they didn't all look alike, okay? So that's a reverse bit of a joke, right? It's a bit of a kick in the shin saying, wake up, guys. We are a bundle of people with various ideas and opinions and various competencies. We want to be recognized as human beings that have an interest in this land. They are still owed from 1902 to 1930 to 1992 promises unfulfilled of land entitlements. Their concerns are that they need a position at the table. Some of the lands in relationship to the pastures are undeeded crown lands. They still are in the name of the Queen. There is still federal crown lands that have never been turned over to the province. The federal government has made a commitment to honor, under the TLE, their duty to consult. Some of those lands could end up in the hands of First Nations ownership. Okay, because there is distinct bands, not the ones I'm representing, that have an interest in their TLE entitlements. Okay? So, we need a management principle because they already know some of these lands are quite far removed from their reserves, and they've had experience with purchasing crown land and then wondering how they're going to manage it when it's 200 miles away from where they live. And worse, they don't have some of the competencies required to manage these sensitive lands. And they've told me that. They understand the need for partnership, and they also need they understand the need for professionally managed land assets. We know that we need an inclusive approach. I won't go into it. We saw a number of the stakeholders. We know that whatever model we come up with people who have an interest or those who can't speak can metaphorically see themselves in our solution. So we need a governance, we need a management philosophy where those various stakeholders can see themselves in it. We also know that the two levels of government currently right now are very committed to increasing trade opportunities. They're openly discussing new free trade agreements with different international partners. So whatever we do, okay, and I think some of the motivations for the federal and provincial government to try to get out of this quickly is because they're thinking, or their view is that in terms of livestock or agriculture, this might be viewed as a subsidy, and for free markets to function, you've got to have less of those. And we saw it with the Canadian Wheat Board being dismantled. We're hearing even in the Liberal platform, in the Liberal leadership, they're talking about supply management. And when some people talk about pastures, they say that some of the grazing rates appear to be artificially suppressed. Okay, so that they could make the case. So whatever we come up with, it's got to be market friendly, or at least be perceived as not being a trade impediment. Really important is you can't allow the division of the masses. And what's happening now a little bit is we see the provincial government saying quite quickly, oh, we'll sell it, right? We'll sell the land. Then they realize, well, we own the land, it's public, it's held in the public trust. Maybe a lot of ranchers and cattle producers, and let me clear when they use the term patron, you heard the term patron? I don't know what that means, because at the federal level, the patron profile, pasture to pasture, not all of them, but a lot of them, changed on an annual basis because we only allowed them to graze on an annual basis. And then when they say we're going to take care of the patrons because the patrons are the custodians and the stewards of the pastures, that's misinformation too. Patrons, and some of the guys from PFRA or the gals will relate to this. They used to say, well, geez, Carl, can we send our cattle to your camp? Because the federal program was such where if you were a cattle producer, okay, or maybe you're just having some cattle on the side to offset your agricultural farm profile, you could apply. You could get space in the community pasture. You would be told when to drop your cattle off and when to pick them up. Our pasture managers, our pasture riders would feed them, breed them, inoculate them, take care of them. You could come, you could take pictures of your cattle at camp, you could send them notes, you could come sing Kumbaya around the fire, but they were ours. Okay? So they didn't run the pastures, and the advisory groups were simply that. They advised us on who they would recommend if there was potential for increased grazing opportunities. Okay? And if you look at some of those profiles, okay, of those pasture patron groups, okay, a lot of them are senior, okay, in their demographic profile, and they're not interested in increasing exposure by purchasing land or running pastures, okay? So we've got to call the messaging that's coming out of all governments as to the accuracy of it, okay? And we need to know what the real substance is, so that's why I share that with you. Okay? Now, the dividing is if you have 62 people negotiating for different governances and different managing approaches, and I know we've talked about easements and all those things, but let's just say we have easements and we have leased arrangements and we have 62 management practices out there. Who governs that? Worse yet, we haven't even talked about the expectations in the transfer of that land. We met with the federal government representatives. Nobody's talking about their expectation for capital investment recaptures. There's tens of millions of dollars of public funds in gates and fencing and corrals, and the federal government's expecting that to be compensated. So we say if we come at it with a large group, 62 represented in one portfolio, your ability to negotiate some of that, to get greater consideration with the federal government. And believe me, the federal government is hoping, right? They're sitting there on the edge of their seat saying, maybe we'll get away with this. Maybe we won't have to pay. No. They're not going to change their mind. Don't get me wrong. I heard some things about Minister Ritz and this and that last night, but guess what? they don't eat humble pie very good. Okay? They're not about changing their mind. Okay? We saw that with the wheat board. Okay? We're going to see it with this. They are going to root in. But they will pay. Right? They don't want to, but we'll have to negotiate that. And the province, and I'm not trying to poo-poo the province, I'm just saying, let's not be in a hurry to get it wrong. They're adamant that they're about patrons. So our proposal has to be inclusive to patrons. It has to protect the greater interest of patrons, but better yet, doesn't our proposal need to be considerate to an industry? Because the pasture program, when it was created in the 30s, wasn't about local patron groups. It was about protecting the interest and the risk management requirements of a larger industry. Okay? So if we have 2,000 patrons, how do they supersede 22,000 producers? Size matters. I think if we can get a proposal that has the representation of the 62 more or less, we can use economies of scale. There's a reason that it was an opportunity within the PFRA program to retain biologists and agrologists, because with the economies of scale, you can factor that into your pricing. Okay, and you can retain those professionals so that the other interests are maintained. Industry versus a patron, again, overall risk management. If you look at the pasture program, it is residual pasture for the industry. And I know there's a lot of discussion, particularly at the federal level, right? This notion that, you know what, climate change, really, there is no scientific data, right? Okay, I'm not going to get into it. You believe what you want to believe, okay? But if you don't think Saskatchewan is prone to drought, you probably haven't lived here long enough. And if you really don't believe that we're prone to drought, just follow the northern Great Plains of the United States this year. Okay? It will happen. So you need to manage your pasture system so that your industry sustains itself in a viable, in a long-term way. So we need, in our proposal, to consider how do we manage that so people have access. If people buy that land, access is reduced. Okay? So if you're a wildlife, consider it. We've met with the Wildlife Federation. Their imperative is access to the land. Okay? If you're an industry patron, a cattle producer writ large, you want access or the potential access for residual pasture for your risk management strategy. And you can't afford to buy. Because buying, we already know the numbers. Even if they were to sell the land to patron groups or individuals that would have to leverage that land and mortgage it, the cost structure per cow-calf pair becomes unviable. Okay? Leasing, same concern. What's the rate? The other thing is we talked, somebody was talking, I think it might have been Doug, about the other revenues. We've talked about historical need, but there is an emerging market. It's called the carbon market. And more and more we're seeing a global convergence on either mitigating carbon through legislative processes or enabling the trading of carbon through market-driven processes. If you follow the California market, okay, the California market just introduced a cap-and-trade program. They had their first auction last week, and it was very successful. They're having a few more over the next 3 years. Okay? The California market is huge. It is the 7th largest economy in the world. $40 billion in agriculture alone. Okay? It is a very important market to Canada. We see carbon taxes in BC, and we're seeing trading programs in Alberta, and Quebec has just introduced a new carbon program. So carbon will converge in terms of pricing, and we think that if the pastures are managed as a portfolio, there could be revenue streams from carbon sequestration given the price per ton on carbon in the future. Okay, that's it. Probably more than you wanted to know, but I like to set the context in terms of, so how does our proposal address some of those things? Okay? So the First Nations Sustainable Land Management Joint Venture, and I know that's a mouthful, and geez, don't even try to do the acronym because it's a mouthful, but essentially It's really, how do we provide sustainable, inclusive management services? And you see, it's management services, not ownership. How do we put a management system on top of these lands, these important lands, that doesn't look like owning it and controlling it, but how do we manage it so that it's sustainable and it's inclusive for all those interests that PFRA has nobly done over the past 80 years? Okay? The other thing is how do you set it so that there's an eye on planning and operations that maximize and measure business success in what we're calling the triple bottom line. And from First Nations, it's a kind of a quadruple bottom line. The triple bottom line that's emerging in the new economy, it's profitability, but not traditional profitability. Okay? Now, I am a self-professed capitalist. Okay? However, I can't be a capitalist built or premised on consumption alone. If we think that our planet is sustainable on the old model of capitalism, which is based on consumption, okay? And I challenge any one of you in the room, on a Saturday morning, in a fall or a spring, drive around your community. Stop in at one of the number of yard sales, okay? You're going to see things that people bought that they never really needed or they never really used. You're going to flip it over. It's going to be made in China. It was bought at Walmart, okay? If we think that we're sustainable buying more and more things from countries like China and others, and I'm not against China, I'm just using it as an example, and I'm not against Walmart, please, right? Okay? But what I am against is mass levels of uncontrolled consumption, okay? Because if we invite China, 1.2 billion, and India, 1.3 billion, to that consumption party, we can already hear ourselves eating ourselves off the planet. So sustainability based on more and more consumption is not sustainable, and it's not good capitalism. The emerging economy is saying, hold it. We need to think a little more directly in terms of what is sustainable. We need to make money. We have to live, we have to work, okay? But we also have to, in that envelope, include environmental integrity. What does it take to manage this planet in an ecological, considerate way? Then we also have to think about social responsibility. What does it take to manage business where people are more than just a liability? I worked with an accounting firm. Anybody here ever look at a balance sheet? Financial statements, balance sheets? Okay, I see them all the time. Now, if you look at the people part, okay, and let me maybe start. When I was leading an accounting firm, I went in and met with accountants. I said, you know what? I think your accounting for the future is wrong. They said, well, what do you mean? We're accountants. We know more about accounting than you. Absolutely. I says, in the historical sense. But in the future sense, you're kind of you're off base. They said, well, what do you mean? I said, well, geez, I look at your balance sheet, and it's missing some things. Right? On the balance sheet, you've got capital assets, right? You see capital assets are depreciable things, right? So you can even depreciate your tax liability because you've got capital assets that depreciate over time. Is that right? Anybody here an accountant? Okay, so I said to him, I said, what does an asset look like that the more you use it, the more valuable it becomes? Oh, that doesn't exist. I said, sure it does. What's an asset? The more you use it, the more valuable it becomes. Anybody? People. It's the wetware, right? Okay? This is the driving force. So we need to nurture this. And if we look at the community pastures, right, it's not about the land. It's how we manage the land, right? It's the intellectual prowess that goes into that investment. That's the asset we're sustaining. So social responsibility is leveraging and allowing people to self-realize in terms of greatest opportunity, okay? Speed it up. Okay. Sorry. Essentially, then For the First Nations, the fourth piece is the spiritual piece, and they will talk about that a little bit this afternoon in the dialogue. And in essence is that they believe there's a spiritual connection with the land, so that's quite important. The project intent for us is to secure a partnership with the province of Saskatchewan that allows them to entertain this joint venture and doesn't diminish their hardline position right now. Their hardline position is we're all about patrons and we're committed to leasing the land. They've provided $7.2 million for them to develop governance structures and business plans, right? So we'd like to get them to entertain this notion that we can do that, but we'll do it in a collective way. I won't go through these for the sake of time, but we have some key objectives that we believe are important. And essentially, we've set up a steering committee with the First Nations that I represent, and that steering committee is being chaired by former Chief Roland Crow. And for those who don't know, Chief Roland Crow was instrumental. He was the lead on the negotiations of the TLE agreements back in 1992. He is a recognized collaborator, and we think he sets the tone for our steering committee and will help us achieve these objectives in a real way. Okay? And you will see him at the lunch dialogue today. Just a quick governance layout. We've got the steering committee. It's populated with Piapot First Nation, Ochapowace First Nation, Nikanit First Nation, Carry the Kettle First Nation, Yellow Quill First Nation, Muscowecan First Nation, and Moosomin First Nation, and it's chaired by former Chief Roland Crow, as I stated. We would be designing a board of directors. Okay, the board of directors would be populated with various stakeholders that could provide not only great insight, but we could leverage their technical capacity as well to improve the management of the pastures. We would try to retain, through a negotiated process with the federal government, a transitional agreement that would preserve the current pasture program management staff and their technical resources, not only at the head office, but also at the pasture level. So we would try to retain all the pasture managers without them losing their rights as members of the collective agreement. We have met with PSAC, the union, and they're quite interested in our proposal. They have not said that they're supporting it, but they're quite interested in protecting the employment rights of their employees. So I think that we could negotiate something with them. Okay, just in closing, we do have a collaborative project plan. I didn't put the plan steps up there, but if anybody wants to know what our steps are, that's great. We have engaged with various stakeholders. We are trying to broker a meeting with cattle producers as I speak. We're hopeful that essentially people will support our intentions, and I'm confident that even today's discussions, at the end of the day, we hope that we will see some of your interests reflected in our proposal. We believe that the inclusive management regime, unified under one voice, is probably the most potent. We think that the government's current disinterest in the pastures isn't going to change, and they will poetically tell you through their communications people that they're not anti-pasture, which would probably be true, but they're not really interested in maintaining what they would look at as a financial liability. Their urgency to act is, I think, predisposed in terms of let's hurry up and get this done so nobody can change our minds. I think we got to take the crowbar and really pry those boards off. It takes a little work, okay? It's going to take some resources, people resources and financial resources to do that, but I think we need them to slow down. We took 80 years to make this right. Why do we take 3 months to get it wrong? Okay? We're not in a hurry to get it wrong. Let's take our time a little bit. Let's breathe. Time to exhale. Okay? I think together we can be successful, and together we will be stronger in terms of negotiating a best position for not only the pasture program or its replacement, but for all the inherent responsibilities that we have to managing these sensitive lands. So Last but not least, I think that we should view this as our responsibility, okay? In a consumption society, in a Twitterverse society, where things just seem to last a second and then we move on, these lands were gifted to us by the people that we saw last night. Candace showed us her family, and historically they worked very hard for us to enjoy this environment. They didn't have this, okay? We do, and it was based on their vision of the future, that I will leave something better. I will not consume it all. So I think we need to do that too, okay? And if we don't do it, I guess who will? So I'll leave it at that.